First off, thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's very nice to be here, as I was saying a little bit earlier. Any excuse I can get to get out of Brussels during the winter and come to a place like Spain is welcome. And also, there's nothing that U.S. diplomats like to do more than talk about themselves and talk about their work. So I'm really happy to have an attentive audience. Just a very quick introduction. My name is Kevin Daucher. I am a U.S. diplomat. I work for the U.S. State Department, and I'm currently assigned to the U.S. mission to NATO. I work in the political section there, and mostly what I cover there is the NATO-Ukraine partnership, but I also cover Georgia and Moldova and a few other things. So I'm not a complete expert on everything that we do, but obviously I work very closely on one of the biggest issues that is going on right now, both at NATO and globally. And I'm very happy to, once we go through this very simple topic of NATO, Russia, China, and the international order, happy to answer any questions either about that presentation, about how NATO works in general, or about how NATO is looking at Ukraine, because that really is my specialty. I'd like to talk today about, I'd like to organize the way I'm talking around a couple things. I'd like to first look quickly at how NATO views itself, then how NATO views the international order, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Russia and its recent actions fits into that, and also how China fits into that. So to begin with, a little bit on how NATO views itself. First and foremost, and because I know we have a range of students here, undergrad to graduate students, we also have faculty here. I'm going to try to be as broad as possible, so I'm sorry if I'm covering subjects that people are already familiar with, but I want to be as inclusive as possible here. So NATO, first and foremost, is an alliance of consensus. That is to say, we do not recruit countries. Every country joins of their own will. We don't evangelize. We don't bring countries in. We leave a door open. We have an open door policy, and countries, European countries, are welcome to join if they choose. We don't expand so much as we enlarge. And then those nations that are members of NATO, we take decisions by consensus. There is no voting at NATO. Every decision that is taken by NATO is agreed by all allies or is not agreed at all. Second, NATO is a political military alliance. I think most of the time when observers look at NATO, the military side of NATO is what gets the most attention. But it is also a political decision-making body. So yes, it is important that we have this military side, and we have a structure within NATO that is a way to plan military operations and plan military planning for the development of the allied militaries. And this structure is made up of uniformed military officers, but their advice then feeds into a political process that is made up of civilian officers, people like me, diplomats, and representatives of the member nations, ministries of foreign affairs and ministries of defense that actually supersedes that military advice. It's also important to understand that NATO doesn't actually have any standing forces of its own. All forces that are controlled by NATO or that are overseen by SACEUR, that is the Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Forces Europe. Actually, let me pause right here. The danger of working in NATO is that we use a lot of acronyms. I am familiar with at least what the acronyms mean, if not what the acronyms stand for. But if ever I use an acronym that you are not familiar with, please raise your hand and let me know. I don't want this to be confusing. I will try to explain, but sometimes the danger is I use them. So SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Forces Europe, is the top NATO general. He is a U.S. general. Does not command any forces that belong only to NATO. He commands allied forces that are contributed to NATO. This is a very tricky proposition because you now have these forces that are sort of that must answer to two different masters. They take their orders on a tactical level from SACEUR, But they also are required by their oaths to respond to their own nation's orders. And so the balance between that requires a lot of organization. It requires a lot of trust among all of the allies. But important to understand that there is no such thing as a NATO army. There are only armies that are from the allies. And then the last element of how NATO sees itself is NATO is a defensive alliance. The key principle behind NATO within the Washington Treaty, this is the 1949 treaty that established NATO and defined the rules by which NATO operates. Probably the key part of that, and the part that everybody's familiar with, is Article 5. This is the article that compels countries to come to each other's defense when it is invoked. NATO is not an organization that, as I said before, seeks to expand or seeks to wage war. It is an organization that seeks to deter attack against the allies and to defend against attack if the deterrence fails. So that is how NATO views itself. So pivoting now to how NATO views the world, I touched very quickly already on the Washington Treaty. This is the 1949 treaty that established NATO. And this, if the Washington Treaty are sort of the rules by which NATO operates, then the strategic concept is the second most important document. And that is sort of the alliance's mission statement. If the Washington Treaty sets the rules, then the strategic concept defines a consensus worldview of how NATO see the world, and then also sort of plots of course of how NATO is going to address those conditions. The strategic concept is a document that is refreshed, or we agree really a new strategic concept every 10 years or so. It's not set in stone. We can sort of create a new strategic concept when allies agree it is time to do so. The last strategic concept that we had was from 2010. And very quickly, well, I shouldn't say very quickly, but over the course of several years, we realized that strategic concept was very out of date. For instance, it mentioned things like the Euro-Atlantic area being at peace. More importantly, it talked about having a constructive relationship with Russia. Back in 2010, maybe this made sense. There was a lot of optimism about how if we pulled Russia in and engaged with Russia and brought Russia closer to some of our shared democratic institutions, that we could alter some of Russia's less agreeable behavior. I think between 2010 and 2022, where we sit now, we realized that was probably unlikely. So beginning in about 2019, allies started talking about refreshing the strategic concept, rewriting it so that it defined the reality as we actually experience it today. In 2021, at the Brussels summit, we made an official decision. All 30 allies leaders decided that by 2022 at the Madrid summit, we would have a new strategic concept. And as I said, this new strategic concept will sort of define how NATO sees the world now as it is. So this new strategic concept that we agreed at the Madrid summit was going to be a really historical document. It was going to be something that defined how NATO operated for probably the next decade. And we knew that coming into the Madrid summit. We knew this summit was going to be a really historic event, even before we saw what Russia was doing in Ukraine. So I want to talk a little bit about, first, what is new in the strategic concept, what is the same in the strategic concept, and how that's going to define how we move forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the other major decisions that we took at the Madrid summit that are beyond the strategic concept. So the three major updates in the new strategic concept that really define a new agenda for NATO. First off, we talked explicitly, allied leaders agreed that there are two main threats that face NATO. The first is Russia. We defined it explicitly as a threat to NATO security. And the second is terrorism, which we also defined as was the second one I think is very easy to agree. The first one was much easier to agree, seeing what Russia had done in Ukraine, and especially when you take into the perspective, when you take into our perspective, sorry, when you take into account the perspective of the allies along the eastern part of NATO, who really see this push by Russia into Ukraine as a danger to them. They look at a lot of Russia's rhetoric and reasoning for why they went into Ukraine and say, a lot of those same reasons could apply to us. If you are sitting in Estonia or Latvia, you say, we used to be part of the Soviet Union. We also have large Russian-speaking populations. Maybe we're next on Russia's menu. So these are now the two main threats that NATO sees. The second major update in the strategic concept was this was the first strategic concept that ever made any mention of China. We very explicitly do not, as an alliance, discuss China as a threat. And a little bit later, when I talk about China, I will discuss sort of the balance between the U.S. view, where we, in our public statements, really do specifically discuss China as a threat, a long-term strategic threat. NATO has not yet agreed to use that term, but we do describe it as, and here I will actually quote some of the ways that we have described China in the strategic concept. A challenge to the alliance's interests, security, and values. We talk about systemic challenges that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, poses to alliance security. And we also talk about China's intent to subvert the rules-based international order. These are really big changes that the alliance had never agreed upon, and I think it sets out for the alliance a new direction. Now, for the next 10 years or so, as long as we are operating under this new strategic concept, we're going to have to decide how we deal with this challenge that we have now defined for ourselves, and how we relate to China, because we are still going to have relations with China, how we relate to China with the understanding that part of China's intent is to undermine some of the structures some of the structures and some of the rules-based organizations that have set up the order that we, the alliance, benefit from. And then the last major update in the strategic concept was it has a much more forward-looking viewpoint now, and talks about many new things, including climate, emerging technologies, cyber, disinformation, hybrid warfare, which is a very nebulous, unclear concept, as things that we must take into account when we are considering our security. And so we have given ourselves sort of a mandate to address all of these issues that we acknowledge are going to be challenges, even if the strategic concept itself doesn't set out how we are going to address these. So those are the new updates, but at the core, the strategic concept doesn't change how NATO views itself. It is an update on how it views the world and the challenges that face NATO, but the three core tasks, this is a big NATO phrase, if you were here, three core tasks, it means these three things. The three core tasks remain the same in 2022 that they did in 2010. The three core tasks are, first, collective defense. This is the Article 5 commitment that I talked about already. Crisis management. This is not just our commitment to defend, but developing our ability to respond to crises, even those crises that don't necessarily mean an Article 5 commitment. This can be terrorist attacks, it can be natural disasters, it can be many things, but developing the ability to respond to crises. So collective defense, crisis management, and third, cooperative security, which is an acknowledgement that the security of the 30 allies, maybe soon 32 allies, or benefits from partnerships with non-allies. So cooperative security is a commitment to work with countries around us to further strengthen our security, and probably theirs as well. So that was the major this was the major, we say deliverable, it's a very Washington word, I'm sorry. It really is a terrible word. So the new strategic concept was the major goal of the Madrid summit before we saw what Russia was doing in Ukraine. And we accomplished that, but given what Russia did in Ukraine, we also had some other also major deliverables that really revolutionized how NATO approaches the international order. The first one is a really major transformation in the posture of NATO forces along the eastern flank of the alliance. This is from the Baltic states all the way down to Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey to a certain extent. But so the Baltics all the way down to the Black Sea. Prior to the Madrid summit, in sort of the immediate response to Russia's invasion, NATO activated elements of what is called the NATO response force, including the very high readiness joint task force, that is the VJTF. The VJTF is sort of the 48-hour response force. This is supposed to be the NATO forces that are on high alert, ready to respond to any threat within 48 hours. And we don't obviously activate this very often. It indicates that there is some sort of crisis, and we need to move armed forces from one place to another. So almost immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine, we activated these response forces to bolster our defense and deterrence along the eastern flank. Very important that what we were doing here, what we did here, was increase our own defense along our borders, right? This was not an intent to move into Ukraine, and no troops did move into Ukraine, but it was to send a signal to Russia that we see what you are doing in Ukraine. We will not allow any such attack on NATO territory, meant to deter Russia, prevent Russia from launching such an attack before it ever did, and hopefully, stave off a war and save many lives in the process. So immediately we did that. We activated these forces, but it also illuminated the problem that we had, that maybe we didn't actually have enough of these forces, and we weren't. And those forces that we did have were probably not at the level of readiness that we needed to have them at in order to really deter such an enormous attack that we saw Russia wage on Ukraine. Had Russia, for instance, tried the same thing in the Baltics, what would have happened? We might not have been able to respond as quickly. So at the Madrid summit, the Allies committed to what we're calling the new force model. And this commits to deploy in place in these countries, specifically along the eastern flank, combat-ready forces. These forces are able to be scaled up very quickly from the relatively small level that they are now to battalion-sized forces in a relatively short period. Different than what they had been before, these forces will now be sort of assigned specific territories, so that they will train in the territories that they will ultimately defend, even if those forces don't live there permanently. So let's say there is a Spanish force that will be part of this response force. When it trains, it will train only in the areas that it will ultimately be assigned to respond to, so that it becomes familiar with the territory, familiar with the people, and develops the skills that you need to effectively defend a specific place, as opposed to being sort of flexible along the entire eastern flank. It allowed us also then to pre-position equipment. If you know that Spanish forces are going to go to a certain place, you can leave the specific equipment that Spanish forces will be using in that place, so that it will already be there when they arrive. And then also we have just committed to maintaining higher levels of readiness. This generally means higher levels of training and probably higher levels of investment, and that's something that we are going to have to figure out a way to implement over the next few years. We have committed to do this. We haven't really found a way to fund it yet, which is going to be an interesting conversation. Beyond the new force model, we're also looking very closely at defense industrial cooperation. One of the things that this war in Ukraine has really highlighted is the need to have weapons when you need them. we're seeing how quickly ammunition for artillery in particular is being expended. And while allies and even many countries that aren't part of the NATO alliance are donating artillery ammunition to Ukraine, we are starting to see that the cupboards that we keep these in our allied stockpiles are running out. And it is not governments that build these things, it is private companies that build these things. And they do not build them, or at least they do not right now have the industrial capacity to build them at the same rate that we are, or that the Ukrainians really are expending them. This is a big problem that we're now looking at and trying to find innovative ways to work with private industry who builds these arms to make sure that in the event of another such crisis, we don't run into the problem where maybe we run out halfway through a conflict. I think if you look specifically at the Russian-Ukraine conflict right now, one of the things that is going to determine who is successful in this conflict is who runs out of ammunition first. Both sides have this exact same problem. I will mention that one other big thing that changed is obviously some non-NATO countries reconsidering their alignment with the world. We've already seen Finland and Sweden who are considering joining NATO. Even countries like Switzerland and Ireland, while maybe they're not donating military equipment, have very clearly taken sides in the conflict and are donating assistance to Ukraine. So that is also one big change, but maybe not one that I want to dig into right now. Happy to answer questions on it. And also disinformation is another big trend that we're seeing. I think it is very clear that European audiences in general have not been influenced or have seen through the sort of Russian disinformation and the Russian line of describing what is going on with the conflict. This is not the case in many other parts of the world, especially in the global south, in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. The Russian messaging has found much more of an audience, or much more of a receptive audience than it has in Europe. And that's probably also something that we're going to have to look at in the future. I want to switch gears a little bit. I've talked now about sort of Russia and Ukraine. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about China. At the beginning, I said the United States views, or the way the United States describes China is as the pacing threat. This is the phrase that we use. It is the long-term strategic threat versus Russia's sort of acute, immediate military threat. We would say, the United States would say, that China is actually the only country in the world that has both the intent and the capacity to successfully undermine the world order. We do believe there is that intent, and the NATO alliance has now agreed in the new strategic concept. That NATO recognition is not, it is a major shift, at least in formally and publicly recognizing it, but it's not brand new. It's something that we've been discussing probably for many years. It's just now we have finally articulated it. We're sort of coming to grips with the realities that the alliance security is not only affected by the intent of its immediate neighbors. We recognize that in a world that is governed so much by cybersecurity, that oceans have less of a protective effect. So we now need to start looking at actors who maybe do not have our best interests in mind and have this ability to reach across oceans through cyberspace. And our assessment is that China is developing these new tools with an aim of maybe not immediate, military intervention in the way that we see Russia intervening in Ukraine, but with an intent to shape the environment to be more strategically favorable to them and less to us. So our next priority is to how to address this challenge. One of the big things we're looking at NATO is building resilience. Resilience is another one of these very broad words that carries a lot of meaning at NATO among the NATO nerds, and is difficult to explain perfectly. But resilience means a couple things. One, building and reinforcing democratic institutions, but also building the capacity to defend our own critical infrastructure, particularly when it comes to cyber attacks. Also building up supply chains. We've seen how important the supply chains are in terms of ammunition and the fight, Ukraine's fight against Russia. But more broadly, the supply chains that sort of support our entire economy run through China in a much bigger way than they run through Russia. And in the event that there is some major conflict, we need to really consider how our economies would be able to maintain their resilience if there were some sort of break with China. I would also say that one thing we're looking at, and I think the U.S. is really driving this conversation, is how we work with our partners, particularly partners in the Asia Pacific who have a lot of experience bumping up against China, if you will. So Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, countries like this who have very high capabilities, both in terms of on the military side. They share democratic values with NATO and the North Atlantic community, and they have more maybe direct experience working next to China. So these are some of the challenges that we're looking at. I think I will leave it there as this is the universe of issues we're looking at, and I'm looking forward to questions later, but I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I feel I've talked far too long.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You certainly raised a lot of points. A lot of issues and questions, and I have a list here of things that I would like to go deeper later. Thank you very much also for this very pedagogical overview of what NATO is and NATO does, because I think that is the basis for everything, to understand exactly what the alliance is, what is it for, and who, how it works. But yeah, let's turn to Gabriela. Gabriela Sánchez de la Costa is an analyst at the National Security Department in Spain. Thank you very much for being here, and looking forward to hearing to you.
First of all, I want to thank esglobal and the Universidad. I want to thank esglobal and the Universidad Autónoma for the opportunity given to be here today with all of you to discuss the international order and the NATO, Russia, and China positionals. First of all, we consider that the change in the world order has already started before the crisis. But this crisis has just left however, we must recognize that the Russian invasion has changed some trends, like the trend in the weakening of the transatlantic link, which is now very much reinforced by the strong cohesion within and between NATO and the European Union. China has also had to slightly abandon its iron alliance with Russia, and Russia has been subject to judgment of the entire international community, especially in the United Nations General Assembly. And I would start with a small introduction of the Spanish strategy, and then I would keep on with the actors like China and Russia mentioned. First of all, I would like to point out that there has been two main disruptive facts in the geopolitical scenario that stand out among many others. First of all, the COVID pandemic, which increased the difference between countries, paralyzed the markets and trade, and created immediate movements, economic crisis, etc. And the Putin's invasion of Ukraine by the European Union. In 2021, when the COVID pandemic emerged, the National Security Department generated a new strategy as we realized it could affect the strategic scenario in many things, such as energy, transport, etc. And this new strategy covered two main threats, like pandemics, that are considered top-level threats to national security, and regional tensions. We consider they may lead to bigger tensions and to conflicts. As we see, many regional tensions are internal crises, as we see in Africa, and many African conflicts, many just stay at the regional level, but some regional tensions do may impact a broader scenario, as we have seen in this case, the most basic form of regional tension in the form of war, like the invasion of Ukraine or the conflict. which has affected the international order. Therefore, we can say that this scenario, like the crisis in Ukraine, was a very important in our strategy, as we had foreseen these regional tensions. We have seen an escalation from strategic tension, diplomatic tensions, illegal annexation, and finally the invasion of the country and the violation of the sovereignty. Unlike other countries, Spain has renounced having always stated enemy from the beginning. As stated in the strategy, we are committed to a diplomatic path to solve tensions, and we count on multilateralism as the best way to do so with the future. And as stated in the strategy, we want to be a country that contributes with peace and international security by meeting our international commitments. Talking now about the actors. Russia has positioned itself as a pariah state in the international community through its actions. There has been a huge amount of suffering and victims as a result of the decision ordered by Putin to invade Ukraine. It has provoked the paralysis of the United Nations Security Council and has pushed back the war to the 60s, because now all issues must be brought to the General Assembly. It is true that there was already a tension since 2014, but we cannot say that this crisis has been a total surprise for the international community. The Russian expansion had already started with the crises like Crimea, Georgia, agreement. However, we never believed that the invasion was going to take place, as the indicators people point out in that direction in the very first time. But evidently, I think the massive deployment of Russian forces in the border that began to generate and everything before very quickly. At this time, the question of the other crisis, because the international reaction has been totally different, has been a compact and solid reaction, and the cohesion of NATO and the European Union has been the biggest surprise for Putin and the biggest obstacle also for him, the future growth. And very positive is unprecedented in recent times in saying the European Union has demonstrated a strength that looks to determine the international order for the next time. Talking about China now, China started as the big ally of Putin with our friendship without limit. But as the crisis continued, we have seen how China is taking more and more distance from Russia, which is a great hope for the international community, as China plays a key role in this crisis. And China has not supplied weapons, it's not crossing any trade line. And so China has also hardened its discourse on the invasion. China has not hesitated to condemn the possible use of nuclear weapons. And we don't know much about the bilateral relation between China and Russia because it's not very transparent. So we can say that something is changing and we also think further. And secure China as an activist to remind its key role in this conflict. And then going later, I believe I've already said everything, but we like to point out that Spain is one of the main partners of NATO, and we have hosted very successfully the last NATO meeting last year in Madrid. The first consequence is this crisis, as said before, is the cohesion of the alliance, which has been a surprise for Putin. Now we can see inside NATO the strengthening of the collaboration in the defense field of 4 countries in the Eastern Europe. We must also answer the call of NATO every time, and we have reinforced our collaboration in our missions, ground and air in Europe, East kind of details that we continue with planes in Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, with radars in Bulgaria, and with missions in Estonia. As a big NATO contributor, it's practically in all NATO and European Union missions, and it's something that Spain can say. 20% of the European Union forces are Spanish, especially in Africa. And finally, I would like to stress how this NATO and European Union coalition has been shown in the following way. Okay, we have shown that we are capable of delivering weapons. But there has been a major turnaround in German policy. In Germany, an essential ally, Germany has donated returns and has cut off its major energy supply with Russia. We have provided a very important economic support. We also share that we are supporting the construction. We share that we open borders with Ukrainians, and we have reinforced or neutralized communities. And finally, if we're talking about international order, we discussed earlier, we think it's very important to introduce a very and a new important actor, which is Africa. Africa, first of all, Africa is emerging as a strategic epicenter of the international order because of its natural resources and above all because of its demographical potential. And secondly, the fact that Africa has shown itself divided in the General Assembly, those to condemn the Russian actions of Ukraine, who also reveal that Africa has its own agenda and its own position. 27 countries have refrained from voting. One has voted against resolution, and that means that we were very unaware of Africa and of the presence of Russia and China in this continent. And now, as I said at the very beginning, we knew there was already there, the change was there, that just has left it significant. And we'll be happy to participate in the questions after. But let me just finish with maybe the most tangible effects of this crisis. First, it is very early to know, we should not rush in our assessment to define a new order, but we should analyze some aspects that for sure will impact this new order and that we will be following closely. First is that the first most tangible effect that the non-proliferation agreement is broken. Iran and North Korea are threatened to develop nuclear weapons. There is an expansion of Russia and China to Africa, as I said, and we have to question us what would be the European Union role then. NATO and the European Union has strengthened their ties, we have said, and it's another very tangible thing. And the European Union is now more and more supporting its strategic autonomy and the development of common security and defense policy. And also, another effect is that new technologies and green energy resources are coming now more and more as this change in the international energy scenario is in place. And marked by the Russian invasion. And so this would be my key notes for this debate. And I would like to finish with some key ideas. First of all, they said this regional attention was already foreseen in Spanish strategy, but Spain has no enemy. We just believe in materialism and we ourselves a country that builds bridges. The foundation of the Union Security Council is one of the most worrying effects being in the way to hold the crisis, and the international means to do so. The most positive and clear consequences, the cohesion and the reinforcement of the transatlantic link that we are seeing now. And I finish with a reflection. It is time for the international community, especially NATO and the United Nations, the European members, to help Ukraine to defend its territorial integrity, but at the same time to work for negotiations that will put an end to the war and close the conflict between those two countries in a certain way, depending on their agreement. And it is also time to analyze the world that will be left once the invasion is over. It's now time to reconstruct the international order and to reestablish the role of the United Nations in this world.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank you, first of all, for reminding us that one of the major uncertain consequences of the invasion. Can you bring the micro? Thank you. One of the major consequences of the One of the major consequences of the invasion was the enforcement of the transatlantic community. You said that Putin and Russia was surprised by that, but I think many of the allies were surprised by that too, because we came from some years of more problematic relationships. So that is a very interesting and key point. And one of the challenges is to keep that alliance and not that alliance, that unity in the coming future. Thank you also for going to the national strategy. It's interesting because it was due next year, if I'm not wrong, or in a couple of years, but its publication was advanced because of the COVID pandemic. Was renewed, it was decided to be renewed, and then the invasion gave another dimension. But also the U.S. has a new strategy, defense strategy published this year. So there is an alignment of documents shaping how countries and nations sees the world of security. Both you have both raised many questions. Let me start asking some short questions, and then we'll open the floor. And by chronological order, by your presentation, Kevin, you mentioned in your description of what NATO is, that is a defensive alliance, which it is, and it's based on deterrence. And one major element of that deterrence is the nuclear capacity. And we are seeing that nuclear is all around with the threats coming from Russia. Can you go a little bit further? What's the role of nuclear deterrence right now? I mean, it is known that in the Cold War, that was a key element to keep peace. And we have to remember so much the Cuban crisis this last month. But how is the state of nuclear deterrence nowadays?
It's a very good question. I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question.
I'm sorry.
The question of sort of the strategy behind nuclear deterrence is one that there's like a priesthood that exists only to do this, and they speak in almost magical terms about it. So I am not the nuclear deterrence expert. I can speak to it on a very broad level. One, you're absolutely correct that part of the alliance's deterrence is the nuclear deterrence. We will always, as long as nuclear weapons exist, we will always say that NATO is and must be a nuclear alliance. Specifically because as long as nuclear weapons exist somewhere else, we must have an effective deterrent against the use of the nuclear weapons that exist outside the alliance. As to how effective that deterrent is, I mean, I think, first off, I think it is an effective deterrent. The effectiveness, I think, is proven in the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used except once. They are deterrent in and of themselves because they are such a horrible weapon of war. I think there is an agreement sort of across the, well, I should say, even the Russian line, and we have seen, while we have seen Russia violate sort of many of the international norms that we had considered that they upheld, but over the last year or two, they have violated so many of these international norms. On the nuclear side, we have not seen movements by Russia that would indicate that we, the alliance, should in any way adjust our nuclear posture. On the other hand, they have been using this very irresponsible rhetoric about sort of implying that they might consider the use of, maybe not strategic nuclear weapons, but tactical nuclear weapons. Where is the line drawn between what actually is a strategic nuclear weapon and what is a tactical nuclear weapon? In either case, they are, radiological bombs that leave, that leave the radiation behind and also just cause, enormous destruction when they explode. The threat itself, the implications they might consider it itself, are enormously irresponsible. But on the back end, behind the scenes, we've not actually seen any movements by Russia to adjust their own nuclear force posture that I think would cause us to do the same, which I think is an indication that the nuclear deterrence still remains effective, that the consequences for the use of a nuclear weapon are still clear enough that Russia, in this case, would not consider using them. It is therefore, I think, incumbent upon us, it's mandatory for us to maintain a credible nuclear deterrence, both to have the weapons, but also to perform the exercises to demonstrate in a very clear, very transparent way that we are able to respond in the event of a first use by Russia, or for that matter, by anybody else who would choose to use it. So I guess my ultimate conclusion is I think the deterrent is effective.
Thank you. Gabriela, we tend to see that the Spanish public opinion is very far from this issue. There is a resonance here, we see opportunities with systemic in the world. We see peaks whenever something like this happens, but then it's not so pressing. What is the role that are there? What is the role of the National Security Department in this changing environment, in general, and towards the Spanish public opinion?
The National Security Law defines security as human security, and there are three main goals of Spanish security policy. It is we are focused on the security of individuals, of the state, and in our contribution to peace and international security. Therefore, we have set a national security system in which the National Security Department plays a central role as coordinator of the relevant actors involved in the crisis, in general administration, in local administration, in ministry. And in this time of crisis, like we've done before, with the COVID, with the La Palma volcano, challenges, and exit from Afghanistan and now Ukraine, it is very necessary to have a solid and comprehensive and prepared national security system that we prepare in normal times for crisis. So, because we believe that the best way is to prepare for this crisis is through prevention, which is analysis. That's what we do in the National Security Department, and also the best way to do the crisis preparedness and crisis management system is another thing we do in the National Security Department. But our main goal is coordinator, so it's at the beginning. And in this role, we have been closely, and this role of prevention also, we have been closely monitoring this crisis since the very beginning, since January, to analysis. Also, the National Security Council Department have coordinated with all relevant actors involved in the crisis, all aspects affecting Spain, and in particular the influx of refugees. And as a result of this successful management of the refugees in Spain, and Estonia and the Netherlands has called on us to learn these good practices, which was for us an honor. And also the National Security Department has been meeting daily at the very beginning of this crisis to closely follow and monitor and to coordinate all actions. We have produced, now we are meeting weekly, and we have produced regular analysis of the situation. We have foreseen the scenarios and indicators of the likely course of action that the crisis could take, which I can disclose. But we have done all this analysis, and we have also managed the refugee crisis that we think was particularly heavy and it has been particularly well managed. And all of this, we can consult the public opinion that might not be related, but we made all this public in our website. We are free to consult all the management at the National Security Department and has done management crisis internally. Thank you. Who wants to make questions?
not like a opinion. I'll give you more time to think about that. Sorry, Ken, you said that you are part of your desk works on Ukraine, Moldova, and these things in general. And I'm very curious to know the position of NATO towards potential future for Ukraine within NATO. That which is, very much under discussion and has been part of this long-standing debate with Russia too, which is threatened by the expansion of NATO. But also I would like you to comment on Moldova and those countries because they are very, very much affected. They have a completely divided population between Russian people and Western people. And I would like you to give us some insights on how you see the security position of that country and also Georgia, for instance, and the future relationship with it.
Very, very difficult.
Also another very simple question. Thank you. Let me begin first with Ukraine and Ukraine's membership aspirations. I'll begin this question in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. Allied leaders agreed and wrote down on paper that Ukraine and Georgia as well will become NATO members. This agreement has not changed, and every time we discuss it, we reiterate this commitment that both of these countries will become NATO members. Now, critically, when we wrote that down, we did not say when they would become NATO members, and we did not give them sort of a checklist. If you accomplish all of these things, then you become a NATO member. So while we have not, and I don't think there is any desire to give up on this commitment, it is still a cause of very great frustration in Ukraine and in Georgia that over the course of, 14 years now, we have not been able to, achieve this membership goal that we set out. There are a lot of reasons why that is so. In the Washington Treaty, Article 10 describes sort of the very basic conditions that a country needs to meet in order to become a member. They need to be a European country who can contribute to the defense of the alliance. I'm not going to quote exactly, but this is a quote. European country, they can contribute to the defense of the alliance, and that they uphold the same values that the alliance upholds. I think certainly over the course of the past year, we have seen, Ukraine is clearly able to contribute to the defense of the alliance. It's very difficult to argue that they are not. They've also absorbed all of this different equipment that allies and even non-allies have been able to give to them. So the question of interoperability between Ukrainian forces and NATO forces has probably also been answered. Over the course of the 2008 through now, one of the main reasons why they were able to do that is because of their partnership with NATO. We've had probably the most substantial partnership with any country with Ukraine. We also have very large partnerships with Georgia, Finland, and Sweden to a lesser extent. But some of the things that we did with Ukraine up until this point was, one, help them develop their military so that they meet NATO standards, so that they move away from sort of the Soviet model of organizing their forces towards a NATO model of organizing their forces. One of the big parts of this was developing a non-commissioned officer corps. This is like the sergeants that run units and are given a lot more autonomy to move their units around. They're given a broader mission and then said, go ahead and figure out how to accomplish that, which is not really present in the Soviet model. And we've seen how effective that model has been in their fight against the Russians. It makes their forces much more nimble and much more able to respond. Anyway, so they've come a very long way in terms of bringing their forces into the NATO model and the interoperability. And we're still left with a lot of the concerns on that third part that I mentioned, sort of It's a very nebulous concept. It's not very well defined in the Washington Treaty. And I think it will be I think there are still some allies who will have concerns over whether they can, whether they meet all these things. It is still very clearly a main priority of the Ukrainians to obtain NATO membership. They look and they see the security that membership has given to countries like the Baltic countries who, were they not members of NATO, might have suffered similar consequences. And they say, man, if you just made us members back in 2008, we wouldn't have suffered this. It's as the person who is responsible for speaking to the Ukrainian mission most often at NATO, for the United States anyway, it's very difficult to have this conversation. But the fact is that we still have, I think, a lot of progress to be made before Ukraine is able to meet all the standards that NATO expects of them to become members. And the fact that Russia invaded them, but this was true at the end of 2021. The fact that Russia invaded Ukraine does not change the fact that they had not sort of met these standards. So there's still progress to be made. I'm now forgetting the second part of your question.
No, it was all together. It was the Ukraine plus Moldova plus Georgia. Potential enlargement and so on.
So on Moldova and Georgia, Moldova hasn't said that they want to become a member. Georgia has the same that Ukraine does. At the Madrid summit, actually, another one of our major deliverables, this terrible word that we must use. One of our major deliverables was increased assistance packages to 3 countries at risk from Russia. So that was Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so we have committed to increasing the support that we're giving to all 3 of these countries, largely based on some of the lessons that we learned from Ukraine. We look at Ukraine and see, well, what did Ukraine benefit from that NATO gave them? What didn't we give Ukraine that we could have, that Ukraine could have benefited from? And we've created more assistance packages to sort of develop the military, but also the civil institutions in these 3 countries that will make them more resilient to future Russian attacks, not just military attacks, but also some of the disinformation. Mm-hmm. So that's how these 3 partnerships are going to be moving forward.
I still have one question about disinformation, which I think is key. Maybe I can move to Gabriela and to Africa, if I may, because that is also an essential part of our security environment. You mentioned refugees and the experience with refugees here in Spain. For us, many of them come from Africa, of course, and we've had several issues with Morocco regarding refugees and regarding immigration. On the other hand, Morocco and Nigeria are in an escalation of increasing their military capacities. On the other hand, and you've also mentioned several crises in which Spain is also involved in the European Union. There are places like Mali, which is being a nightmare, if I may say so, where the France is getting out. There are many other very, very strong conflicts, especially in the center of Africa. How does Spain define all these range of threats and challenges? And on the other hand, how can we face them from a positive angle? I mean, we tend to look at Africa always with that challenge, that huge challenge in mind, but there are many opportunities there. So how can we combine both aspects?
Yes, I said Africa is a key player. We're talking about international order in Africa and the importance that we will have in the future. It's having known in the present and will have in the future. Africa is also the reserve place for the European Union external action and for the Spanish external action. And for example, we have in our Plan Africa, they want to take the lead in Africa because the African, but as I said, the African continent talking about what's the positive news that we are recovered internationally, and for us, that's good for studies. It's a key priority for the studies. At the same time, the challenge, as I said, we have these crises have revealed that the China and Russia influence in Africa, we also have mentioned, is something that we were not so fully aware of. And not we have seen it, and we have their answers even very clear in the way they're voting, and they have refrain or abstain or not condemn, or also on the claims that the African Union, for example, has said on the position of the African countries in the United Nations Council, General Assembly, and well, the African conflicts have been forgotten by the international community. Why we should respond? That's true, but none of the open conflicts in Africa respond to a violation of the national sovereignty of another country, someone as the one said in the center. So yeah, that's fine, and there's an opportunity today because of its natural reserves and demographic potential. It's a challenge the way that it's influenced by Russia and China in a very highly expected community. Is there any questions? Please.
Thank you very much. Is it working?
No, I think yes. Sorry. So welcome, and thank you for both of you to coming here from the university. My name is Angel Rodriguez. I'm associate professor in economics here at the university and the head of the School of Economic Intelligence. And I have two questions, but it's the same question, but related to two different geographical areas. So the first one I think is for you, Kevin, because the United States is more involved in the let's can I say the Taiwan conflict, or maybe the growing tensions there. My question for you is, what the United States expects from the European Union and NATO in the case of, I know it's very remote probability, but there is a small chance that there will be a full-scale invasion in Taiwan. And the second is for you, Gabriela, I guess. It's more related to European issues. It's not on the Western Mediterranean, but on the Eastern Mediterranean. Growing tension between Turkey and Greece. Last week, President Erdogan made a very bold speech about sending missiles to Athens and all that stuff. And my question is, what will be the European Union position in the case of, let's say, a very serious incident in the agency? So I know there are no easy questions at all. Okay, thank you very much.
I will attempt this. Now, I preface this by saying I'm not a China expert. Obviously, the Taiwan question is a very delicate one. So if I don't use exactly the right words to describe this, I apologize. If the question is the hypothetical, what does the United States expect of the EU and NATO in the event of some sort of military invasion by mainland China against Taiwan? I don't think we even want to go as far as expecting that. One of the I think one of the major things we want to accomplish out of the unity that my colleague described of the Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a demonstration to any country that would seek to accomplish these kind of political goals through military means, that they're not effective ways of accomplishing their goals. So if the question is what would we expect, I think actually what we would expect is actually doing something now. The response to Russia is not just a response on this acute incident, although it is very important that we help specifically Ukraine win the war. demonstration that we uphold these international norms and that there is a very unified response when we see a blatant violation of these international norms, and that then any future country that would seek to violate those norms can expect a similar response.
Thank you for your question. I'm afraid I cannot talk on behalf of the European Union.
I know.
They're going to exceed my limits. But we know this ongoing tension between Turkey and Greece. But as I said before, I think we can say, according to our strategy, that Spain, if we can't talk about the European Union, but that Spanish position would be always on the side of, in this crisis, developed on the side of dialogue and multilateralism and supporting negotiated solution by and according to international means.
I don't think I've mentioned my last question on this information, and I want to make a question to both of you with your different perspectives and angles. You've mentioned, I mean, it's been mentioned how critical it is for us as threat in general. We've seen it for the last decade, how it has impacted elections and it plays on polarization in our societies, and it goes beyond the current situation of a war in Europe, but of course that is a very critical moment. Gabriela mentioned that the Russian propaganda in this particular case is not so strong in our society, but I think that it's partly so because we ban Russian media and we ban some of the weapons that they've been using to spread that propaganda, like the TV channel RT and Sputnik and so on, which goes against our belief in the fundamental right of freedom of expression. So my question to you both is, how do you think disinformation playing in this particular case in our societies, not in other societies, and in general, what ways we have to counter to fight against disinformation? I know it's also very, very broad, but just a few general ideas if you want, if you can share with us.
Thanks. It is a really good question and a really important issue to discuss. I think again, going back to the last question, one of the most important parts of this response against the Russian invasion was the unity of the response, and that unity within the North Atlantic or the Euro-Atlantic community would not have been possible had we not all been on the same page regarding what the truth was on the ground. As I said before, we've probably not seen, and we therefore haven't seen the unified response in bodies like the UN. We haven't seen that unification of understanding across the globe, because, as you said, some of the other societies, maybe Latin America and Africa, South Asia, are a little more penetrated by the Russian media. I think the thing to do, or the most important thing that we need to work on, therefore, is the sort of information resilience of our populations. This is not an easy task. You talked about the banning of the Russian media, and while I agree that was effective, it is it's a very aggressive move, and it is, as you said, it comes into conflict with some of the values that we uphold. The way to address the problem without coming into conflict with the values that we uphold is sort of taking the other hand and making sure through a very active measure that our populations understand what it is. It's a much harder thing to do than banning the opposing message. Is making a very strong case for your own message. It's much harder, it's much more expensive, it takes a lot of work, and it probably takes a lot of work over a very long time. We're talking about civics education in schools and sort of building critical thinking skills among the population, which are in many places, including the United States, sort of on the decline. It requires a tremendous investment, and I don't know that I have a really good answer on how to do it, but I think that is the key on how to accomplish this ultimate goal without violating those very fundamental principles. And when we do violate those fundamental principles, we see that it gives, ammunition to the opposition. The Russians always point at bands of RT or bands of Sputnik and say, look, they don't uphold freedom of speech either, so they're exactly the same as us, which is not true, but it is sort of playing into their hand. The way therefore you don't play into their hand is by taking the much more difficult path, but the sort of righteous path of making sure that your population is educated.
We have we talked about this info that this information is we have also monitoring this information at the National Security Department through our team. And as Kevin has said, we also think that we need to respond to your messaging. And as I said before, for example, we have published on our website what we have been doing. So we are very open about what we do.
Transparency, as opposed to what we do, right? And I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge and insights. Very interesting. As I said, I have many more questions, but we'll have to leave that for another day. Just a reminder for the students who are here. As you know, this program has two parts. One is debates that you can also watch again on our website on esglobal, and the other one is the competition. And the competition allows you, if you win, one winner per university to go to Brussels to visit NATO headquarters, Kevin will be there, and to have a direct contact with other institutions and people related to security, which is a real, you can see the experience of former winners. It is a really interesting thing. So I invite you to participate, to send your ideas with us, to check the basis of the competition in our website. And again, I thank you all for being here this morning.